So we're now live. Hello there and welcome to this plenary session at the Horasis Global Meeting. My name is Rosalind Mathieson from Bloomberg in London, and I'm delighted to be with you all today and with this esteemed panel for this interesting topic. I was actually reflecting on the topic for the plenary today, and I was struck by how it feels every day that we're glued to statistics in some fashion. More than 173 million virus cases, more than 3.7 million official deaths, with the unofficial number no doubt much higher, lost economic output in the trillions. At the same time, more than 2 billion COVID inoculation doses given, and worldwide weekly infections, the least in almost 3 months. Economic output lost in the trillions. There's a lot to measure. And one of the things that we somehow also need to map in all of this is trust, or potentially distrust. Has faith in global institutions gone up or down in the past year? In governments, in the health industry, in bureaucracy? And that's something that does bear examination, because trust between governments and those who are governed leads to good governance. Trust in governments means people are more willing to adhere to rules and regulation, for example. It allows governments to act quickly and decisively. It allows implementation. It helps things like vaccination rates, and it limits risky behaviour. And so to facilitate that trust, governments need to be clear. They need to explain. And as much as possible, they need to avoid sudden, frequent changes of course. There is a fair body of work out there that shows that in the early part of the pandemic, at least, there was a rally around the flag mood in many countries that we'll get through this together. But equally, the evidence shows that as time has gone on, that trust has faded and skepticism has crept in. Adherence has fallen. People, my own anecdotal evidence in London, they have stopped wearing masks. They don't rush to get vaccinated. They stop social distancing. They question the data, and they may even question government policy. And alongside that public trust in governments, there's the question of trust and sharing between governments, between regions, between governments and key institutions like the WHO, the UN more broadly. On the one hand, it's amazing how quickly the world has developed vaccines, and those vaccines are being distributed. Equally, vaccine sharing in many places has been slowed, and data sharing has been patchy. And how much is that potentially creating lost opportunity? As we hopefully come out the tunnel of the pandemic and we start to restore our lives and our economies, what sort of world are we going to be creating? What lessons are we taking for other common issues where sharing and trust is required, like climate change, poverty alleviation, the fight against other terrible diseases like malaria, like dengue fever, and so on? The pandemic has brought us enormous challenges, and fighting it in the aftermath could equally provide us with opportunities when it comes to governance. The risk is that we fall back in old ways and old habits, and we miss the opportunity for structural change. I am delighted to welcome our panelists here today to discuss this in more detail. I'm going to invite each of them to speak for several minutes, after which we can open up to questions. There's a comment bar on the platform. I'd encourage you to put your comments and questions there where I can see them and ask our panelists the questions on your behalf. I would like to start by inviting Minister Rania Al-Mashat, who's the Minister of International Cooperation in Egypt, to begin with her opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for pinpointing a very important topic in general. Credibility of governments is a function of transparency, and it's through transparency that we increase trust. Maybe one of the very distinguishing factors in the pandemic is that nothing could be hidden. If there is a pressure on hospitals, it is evident. If more people are getting sick, it is evident. So there was I don't want to say pressure, but there was it was a catalyst for governments to actually communicate more frequently with the public. And this was extremely evident across different countries. And it is through that dialogue that different citizens in different countries became more careful with masks and so forth. So what I'm trying to say is that one of the lessons of the pandemic is the power of communication. How, in the age that we live in today, something happening in one country goes all over the world. And this has put, I would say, more checks and balances on the work of the different institutions and the different organizations. It has pushed for a higher level of collaboration. Something else which is extremely important, as Ministry of International Cooperation, we work with all our bilateral and multilateral development partners. And early on in the pandemic, through, again, the importance of communication, we were able to reach out to our partners to show the needs of the government early on, whether they were related to health, whether they were related to equipment. And it was through collaboration that many of these, we had seen fruits out of this collaboration through multi-stakeholder platforms, country dialogues. So this was, again, a tool for us to create a platform of communication, pushing for transparency and trust between us and our different development partners.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I'd now like to turn to Taro Kono, who's the Minister for Administrative Reform and Regulatory Reform in Japan, and of course has had many other key roles in Japan previously, including Foreign Minister.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity today. Well, as you know, Japan is an island country, and as COVID-19 spread throughout the world, we had to close down the country. And we were worried about disruption in energy and food supply. But surprisingly, the energy supply, food supply, there was no disruption throughout this pandemic. And I guess our global system is very strong and resilient. I think we can have faith in a global system now. The other thing we learned is we can share data. I mean, some consumer product or gold or oil. We cannot share gold or oil. If I own oil, you don't. But data, we can share. Actually, if we share more data, more value those data have. We share a lot of data to speed up the vaccine development. And it was amazing. We now have vaccine and we have been inoculating for COVID-19. So we can do this better. The bad thing is, up to the developing the vaccine, we are very successful, the sharing. But once the data turn into product, we stopped sharing. Some people keep buying more than their population, and we are not sharing the vaccine equally among the people. So we need to learn to share data to increase its values. And for a lot of international systems, some we succeed and some we fail. WHO did a good job, but we still exclude Taiwan. When we try to fight against the pandemic, we need to put everyone on board. If there's anyone who is not present, and then there could be a black hole. So we need to build a trust among the global institution as well. Some people trying to use vaccine as a diplomatic tool. I don't think that was right. And some country trying to sell or donate monitoring technologies, saying this technology is to monitor the COVID-19 patient to stop the spreading it. But actually, those technology have been used to monitor the opposition to the government. So we have seen some ugly side of diplomacy, But once this is over, I think we need to rebuild the international order. So there's a lot of things we need to work on after COVID-19. But for now, thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Kono. We do have some pre-recorded remarks from the Minister who wasn't able to join us, but we're not able to play those just yet. So at some point during the panel, we will get those comments from our esteemed colleague from India. So I would like to just begin then by asking some questions of our panelists. And Mr. Kono, I wanted to follow up something that you talked about, and you mentioned some of the ways that governments have used the pandemic for geopolitical means. And I wondered, how much did the pre-existing global structure where we had some countries already distrusting each other or institutions distrusting each other and not in that habit of sharing openly, how much did the existing environment going into the pandemic play into some of the ways that we've seen that come during the pandemic itself?
Well, some government definitely tried to use this pandemic to sell their political system or ideology. In order to fight against COVID-19, it is sometimes important to give government some authority to lock down the cities or authority to stop the movement of the people and those things. So some country trying to sell the dictatorship would be more powerful to fight against COVID-19. And I don't think it is right. I mean, in Japan, the central government of Japan has no authority to lock down the cities. We don't have authority to command doctors to come forward for inoculation. We had to ask people to stay home. The central government is still asking doctors to help us vaccinate the people. And we have been still able to contain COVID-19. So actually, democracy and freedom are still very important in our society. But in some society that democracy is used against it, some people saying that democracy will slow down the process in fight against the COVID-19. I don't think that is right. So we need to promote the value of democracy, rule of law, freedom, even after the COVID-19. And I think it is very important for us, the like-minded country, to sit down and trying to rebuild the value, the common value we shared after the World War II.
And would you include inclusion in that? You did mention Taiwan in your opening remarks, and of course Taiwan is excluded from certain institutions, including active involvement in the WHO. Do you think that that's been to the detriment of the fight against the pandemic, and particularly, again, the sharing of data?
Well, WHO is a very unique international organization. It takes leadership to fight against COVID-19. And in terms of science or universal health coverage, we cannot exclude anybody from that forum. So there's a political argument concerning Taiwan. I understand that. But when we try to fight against the pandemic, we need to put everyone on board.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Minister Al-Mashat with a question, which is sort of just following up on some of the opening remarks that you made, and particularly your role in international cooperation. I mean, what have you seen through the past year from your perspective as examples of good practice? Like, what has been successful in all of this, because there have been some moments of great global cooperation. And equally, where have you seen the parts of this, for want of a better phrase, where it could have?
I believe that very early on, when the pandemic broke, there was a feeling that multilateralism has come to an end, and that every country should be on its own. There was just this feeling of mistrust, if you will. But I think 2 months into it, it was very clear that we are all in this together. And if we used to talk about financial contagion, today we're talking about this pandemic contagion. So what happens in one country definitely affects the other countries. And when the economic slowdown happened, it affected everybody. Look at aviation, look at tourism, look at the ability to move, mobility itself. So this required a rethinking or a rhetoric, a stronger rhetoric around multilateralism. We saw countries having more dialogue. We saw very quickly G20 taking different initiatives to alleviate debt on the very poor countries in Africa. So there was, I would think, a renewed discovery of the importance of working together. And this is going to push other agendas, as we see on the climate change. It used to be only a group of countries talking about it. Today, green recovery is something which is very much discussed. There are financing tools for the green recovery. There's a renewed, I would say, push towards common denominators between countries. That said, however, we find discrepancy in how different financial institutions are moving forward. Some are more flexible and have been able to provide assistance, financing quicker than others. Others have been constrained, if you will, by some of their either internal bureaucracies or maybe their capital. So I believe that going forward, given the need or given the understanding that what happens in one country, affects everybody, there is definitely a need for, if we borrow what the IMF said, all hands on the deck. We need all institutions on the deck to be able to push, or mitigate the, further downfalls on different countries. So I would just say that we need to see, a stronger commitment, if you will, from different institutions to push for the reforms that certain emerging countries are doing to pull themselves out of the pandemic.
Because it does feel, as you were saying, that there are a lot of things that could be taken from this experience and applied to many other, what you would think of as global common issues, be it climate change, as you mentioned, fighting poverty, inequality, innovation, education, and so on. And these are things that affect every country, as you pointed out. But how confident are you that we will take what we've learned here and apply it elsewhere? As you said, there is that challenge, particularly around financial institutions and reform in terms of being more flexible, perhaps in terms of things like financing and so on. Do you see momentum pushing on from this into those other important areas?
So all the objectives that you mentioned, poverty, no hunger, clean water, all of these come under the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. So countries came together in 2015, agreed that there are 17 global goals. Every country put its 2030 development agenda, so that when 2030 comes, we try and see how these common goals across humanity can be fulfilled. Of course, the pandemic came. There was a fear that it would derail the fulfillment of the SDGs, and also the financing of the SDGs, being around more than $3 trillion, if you will, to be able to close these gaps. So what's going to happen now is that capital is going to become very select. And it's very important that every country tries to distinguish itself by the strength of the reforms and its commitment to pushing forward. As capital from financial institutions or financing from multilateral institutions is less than before, the private sector, sovereign wealth funds can come in. And you need to give a compelling case And that's why, these concepts of ESG have come out, so that every country, as they're designing their projects, whether they're sovereign projects or even with private sector, that these common goals are there, because capital today wants to be impactful, capital today wants to be purposeful, and it all revolves around trying to fulfill these sustainable development goals. In our case, as a country, the ministry has come out with principles of economic diplomacy. We have 3 principles. The first one, multi-stakeholder platforms. That's where we engage all development partners on what our prospects are, what the projects we need are. The second thing we did, the second principle, is that we mapped all our development finance, the ODA finance, to SDGs, so that everyone can see where the dollars went to serve these global goals. And number 3, we create a common narrative with our developed partners, people at the core, projects in action and purpose as the driver. So there's this keen effort in trying to make sure that the reform agenda is well known, and that everyone who wants to come and create impact finds a venue.
This is, I guess, a question for both of you. So whoever would like to go first. But in terms of kind of maintaining a sense of trust in government and sharing a momentum, there is the reality that many people are saying, well, it's been very difficult. I've been out of work for a year, or I've had other challenges, but somehow it's going to be okay, and the economy is going to pick up and my job will come back. But for governments everywhere, there is the challenge that at some point hard decisions have to be made around spending. Some governments are going to have to confront the reality of potentially raising taxes because of the amount of money that's had to be understandably spent through this process. So then people will say, well, now the taps are being turned off, taxes are being raised, we're in a difficult fiscal environment. All the money that you said was going to come for projects and reform can't come because there is no money. So what is the challenge there, the future challenge, I guess, for governments in terms of maintaining that trust contract with their people, that the governments will continue to ensure that they're taken care of? I'll open that to...
Well, the Japanese people have been through similar things before. We had huge earthquakes in Kobe back in 1995, and the Great East Japan earthquake recently. And each time the government had to come rescue people, spend a lot of money to reconstruct, and we would share through the taxation for some time. We're still paying some additional tax for recovery from the Great East Japan earthquake. So this pandemic, the government need to do whatever it takes to sustain the economy. And once it's come back, I think, people need to pay back through the tax. But it is not the time yet. It is still the economy is trying to recover, and the government trying to sustain the people. So it is not a time to discuss how we're going to finance this time. But government need to do whatever it takes to keep the people going.
What I can say is that governments have to be time consistent, and time consistent means that you take policy actions given the information set that exists. And today we are in an information set that changes every moment. So I think what has happened over the past year and few months is people being more susceptible to the idea that shocks can happen. And they come in different forms. Once it's a partial lockdown, once it's no aviation for some time, etc. Everybody has to go and take their vaccine. So the important element for governments, especially emerging markets, is that your commitment to reforming your economy, your commitment to trying to push the potential of the economy, to allow for additional capital to come in, to allow for private sector engagement, because our reform agenda is not finished yet. So trying to be more proactive, less complacent, and just all the time, not being held back by this crisis. On the contrary, trying to take it as an opportunity to showcase that you are still committed to these reforms that are going to create more employment, that are going to create more diversification. And this is what we have been trying to do on our different sectors in the country. It is not always easy, but Egypt has not been new to different challenges recently. But we were the only country in the region that is growing positively in 2020 despite the pandemic. And this comes on the back of reforms that happened before 2020. And we are continuing, whether they are structural reforms, whether they are sectoral reforms related to renewable energy, to transportation, establishing new cities. So all of this provides opportunities for the future. And that's what we're betting on.
Thank you. So speaking of energy, we do actually have some remarks that were delivered to us, recorded by the Indian Minister for Petroleum and Natural Gas, Dharmendra Pradhan, who unfortunately couldn't be with us in person today. So I just would ask if we could maybe play those comments.
I'm happy to be addressing this gathering virtually today. In the past 2 decades of this millennium were warning shots against the perils of unfettered capitalism, then 2020 should probably be marked as year when an all-out war was launched by the global community to counter such a scenario from coming fruition. The collapse of global supply chain triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic set up a perilous domino effect across the economic centers of the world. Debate between lives and livelihoods were engaging concern for many nations. Even before the pandemic hit with vengeance, the interest for investing in environmental, social, and governance (ESG) had already been growing globally. The biggest issue for many was the impact of climate change and the ways to address it both as individual nation states and in making concrete efforts. However, the pandemic has brought ESG issues to the fore with a forceful urgency, drawing an imperative for societal responsibility and collective action. The Indian economy has rebounded strongly from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, flowing of the resumption of the economic activities aided by strong fiscal and policy reforms undertaken by the Government of India under the dynamic leadership of Honorable Prime Minister Sri Narendra Modi ji. IMF recently revised India's GDP growth forecast and has projected a growth of 11.5% in 2021, making the country the only major economy of the world to register a double-digit growth this year amidst the coronavirus pandemic. Needless to say, energy is integral to support our fast-growing Indian economy and its ambitions. Our energy sector will be growth-centric, industry-friendly, and environment-conscious. We have the onerous task of ensuring ample access to the energy to improve the lives of Indians, coupled with the need to have a smaller carbon footprint. And to address the needs of all stakeholders, the oil and gas industry must define a new social contract aligned sustainability to overall corporate strategies and embracing responsible leadership. By doing so, the sector has the opportunity to contribute towards energy transition. As we approach COP26 in Glasgow later this year, it is the responsibility of the governments, civil societies, individuals and corporates to contribute. We can and we should work together. I wish this forum all success. Thank you, friends.
Thank you very much. I would like to just follow up with a question again for both of you. And we've sort of talked about the process of managing trust and sharing through the pandemic, and you've talked in really interesting fashion about the experiences of each of your countries as well in that, which has been sort of different and similar in equal measure. I'm curious, when you look back over the past year, and of course it's one of those things where you sort of have to learn as you go in a way. You take prior experience of crises, but this has been a different crisis, I think, than any of us would remember. Do you have, when you look back, are there any things about the way that your country or government has managed this crisis that you regret or you feel you could have done differently?
I would say that the lesson learned is that this concept of stakeholder capitalism is really true. That governments, businesses, civil society, international community all work together in a country to get out of a crisis of this magnitude. Government can do it alone. Private sector needed help from the government initially. Civil society was very much needed in the different, governorates to help with masks and health and so forth. And the international community and our development partners were fundamental as well. So I think that the silver lining in this was that the cooperation, collaboration are real, are possible. And if they do happen, then we are able to get out of a crisis faster or with less cost or loss than we would have been if we were alone. So I think this is the key taking, and I hope that we continue taking this forward in good times, because collaboration honestly does fulfill bigger prospects, bigger objectives, and as we are all trying to push for the SDG agenda across, whether it's climate change, renewable clean water, no poverty, gender parity. All of these are going to require public-private partnerships. They are going to require that all stakeholders are working together under very clear objectives. That's what I have taken out of this and will push forward. And finally, in crises, there's no time to be optimistic or pessimistic. You just have to act. And that is what I think all governments around the world tried their best to do.
Well, two things we could have done better. The first thing is Japan, or the Japanese government is lacking emergency measures. We started the vaccination for regular people. We started from the senior citizens in April. We started the vaccination for doctors and nurses in February. We were lagging behind United States or other European countries because we had to do the clinical trial on 160 Japanese people to make sure it's okay to try this vaccine on the Japanese. In United States, they had about 40,000 people going through the clinical trial, and there must have been some Japanese Americans or Asian Americans. And if we see the records, we could probably confirm the safety of the vaccine on the Japanese people. But the Japanese has a very unique tendency towards the vaccine, and we had to have safety test on the Japanese, and that delayed a couple of months. And we should have started the vaccination much earlier, and we couldn't do that. Even through this pandemic, we had to go through the regular trials. And so in case of emergency, the government should have some different measures to counter the emergency, and we are lacking it. And related to that, the division of the responsibility between the central government and the local government stayed the same through this pandemic. Vaccination is a job for 1,741 cities and towns in Japan in regular times, like when we are doing regular seasonal flu vaccination. It is a job for cities and towns. And we are still asking cities and towns to do this COVID-19 vaccination. So 1,700 cities and towns are doing this every day now. Maybe the central government should have stepped in and used different measures to counter this emergency, but we didn't do it. So we are simply asking private doctors to come forward and do the vaccination for the people. So there are some things we need to prepare for the next pandemic. I mean, we had our SARS, MERS, and Novus flu in 2009, and this COVID-19. And there's going to be another one coming pretty soon. And are we ready? We'll probably not. We'll probably need to change roles of the government, what we can do in terms of emergency and those things. So something we need to discuss once we contain the COVID-19. We need to have a big political discussion on these issues.
I want to ask you, Minister Kono, about your comments about, you talked about the robustness of democracy in this and in Japan and the need to kind of stress that as in the global architecture. And I guess in Japan, there's a strong vein of people doing the right thing. Arguably, we could talk about the UK, which is also a democracy, and whether people did the right thing, but I don't want to get into that here. But there's a question from one of our viewers is, do you believe that the concept of democracy will change after the pandemic? Do the tenets of democracy need to be examined? Do you see that changing in any way? That was one question from the floor.
Could you repeat? I lost your voice.
Do you believe that the concept of democracy will change after the pandemic in terms of re-endorsing democracy on the global stage, for example? Are there certain parts of that need to be strengthened, for example?
Well, I think the democratic country have been doing it pretty well. I mean, it takes time to make decisions, but through democratic process, we get people understand the concept of what we need to do. And people are much easier to obey the rules rather than, the central government telling people what to do without much explanation. So I think the democracy works through this COVID-19 quite well. It takes time to initiate, or it takes time to let the government exercise authority. But once people understand what they need to do or what this is all about, I think in a democratic country, I think people understand and people behave accordingly. So at the end of the day, I think democracy will manage situation better than dictatorship in the long run.
And something both of you talked about throughout is data sharing, and there is interest from our viewers today about the sharing of data. And I wondered if you could talk, maybe start with Minister Al-Mashat, about the challenges of data sharing with the private sector, because obviously, a big private pharmaceutical companies will say, well, even though we're acting on the global good right now, we also at some point need to think about our own financial futures, and we need to think about our business, and we need to think about funds for future R&D, and we need to think about proprietary information, like how much of what we discover do we share and give away. And I wondered if you could start, Minister Al-Mashat, by talking about the challenge of data sharing when it comes to the private sector, and then I'd be interested also in Minister Kono's questions about that answer.
Of course, intellectual property rights are very important to protect what private sector is doing, and that's what encourages them to come to countries versus others. I want to say that, for instance, if I'm going to take the vaccines, given our location and given the size of the market and the our openness to Africa and proximity, many of the big companies are now going to produce the vaccine in Egypt. So this is an example of, if you want to call it R&D transfer or collaboration, that and here data will be shared with the manufacturers, data with respect to the tests or who, how things are going to be produced and so forth. So again, there's more level of openness by virtue of the world we live in today. And I believe, for instance, for some of the vaccines to be approved so that people can travel with them, the companies had to avail the different tests and the results of the tests so that there's credibility around it. So it's not a perfect world, but we are moving towards more, if you will, compelled openness or a need to be more accommodative, whether it's the demands of the private sector for protection, or if it's for data sharing to be able to move forward and create that ability to move and be part of the new global structure that is coming its way.
In a previous time, you can monopolize gold or you can monopolize oil and you can make wealth out of it. But in today's time, you cannot monopolize data. Well, I mean, you could, but if you try to monopolize the data, it probably would not increase its value. You need to share data, and the more you share, the value go up. So it is very important how you share the data without infringing your privacy. So setting the rule, data sharing rules globally is very important. Right now, some private company trying to accumulate data for their own
It looked like,
and if the government trying to dominate data, it probably wouldn't work. So we need to all come forward and talk about how we going to share the data and increase the value, and how we going to share those increased value. So the rule making is very important, and if we are successful, I think it will increase the the wealth on this planet. So that's the future we need to go after.
Thank you. So we are almost out of time. We only have 2 minutes left, and I want to thank you both for a very interesting conversation and for your candor here today as well. And I would just like both of you, if you have any final thoughts for 60 seconds or so each, to give us those before we wrap up.
I would just say that, despite the pandemic, I've been able to travel the world over my screen, but this has not substituted the human interaction, which is very important to create trust. So one of the key elements of trust is for people to mingle and be able to brainstorm physically. So I think this is something that we are all looking forward to. But let's not waste all the lessons that we have learned, and let's carry them through in the good times, because good times are going to come, and they are going to also require a lot of collaboration, a lot of trust building to basically push more credibility that is much needed in the future.
Since 1980s, I have been involved in promoting telework, and
It looks like we may have just lost the minister at the very end there. His video was starting to...
People are moving out of Tokyo. And, the Tokyo is always sucking up the population. But first time in so many years, people are leaving Tokyo for the rest. And it is I think, a good thing. And if we can promote telework, I think we can do so many different things in the future. And I think we can enjoy the development of new technology.
Ministers, thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for the interesting discussion. I hope that our participants have enjoyed it as well. And I wish you safe travels, and may we meet in person before too long.
Thank you for a great moderation. Pleasure meeting everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lost the voice.